My name is Faye Delaney. I'm 36 years old, a decorated staff sergeant with 15 years in special operations, including 3 deployments in the Middle East, and 2 commendations for actions I never spoke of again. I speak 4 languages, but the one I learned to use best is silence. That morning, the range was blistering with heat and testosterone. It was a joint training day, SEAL candidates infantry, even some officers rotating through. My unit had been folded in without name tags or introductions. They called it cross-evaluation. I called it theater. I wore a standard-issue t-shirt, combat pants, no insignia. Nothing about me stood out except that my name had been last on the roster. Delaney. When the list was read out loud, a few heads turned. One of them was my father. He hadn't seen me in 5 years. Not since the day I enlisted. Lowly soldier, he scoffed with a chuckle loud enough for others to hear. Couldn't even make it past the language corps. That wasn't true. I chose to leave it. But the truth never mattered to him, only control. The younger guys picked up on his tone and laughed along, thinking it was fair game. Someone even joked they should let me shoot for fun. I said nothing. I didn't argue, didn't correct. I just walked to the lane farthest from the rest, lane 7. Unclaimed. Isolated. Just the way I liked it. I placed the M24 on the bench. It wasn't just any rifle. It was the one I'd used in Aleppo, a city that remembered blood and sand better than any archive. My fingers slid over the metal like greeting an old friend. The first 3 shots cracked tight-centered. 1 hole. I felt the air change. The next 5 dead center, no variance. My breath stayed calm, rhythm set. By the time the 10th round was done, no one was speaking. 20 rounds later, the record that had stood at this range for 23 years, set by a Marine sniper named McNulty, was broken by a woman whose father still called her a disappointment. When I finished, I lowered the rifle gently and rolled up my left sleeve. Not for show, but because sweat itched beneath the ink, an old tattoo, a Delta emblem with a coded designation. It wasn't stylish, it wasn't new, it was earned. The range commander, a man who had once commanded joint rescue ops in Kandahar, stepped forward. His eyes dropped to my forearm. He stiffened. "Wait, is that—" "The legendary sniper from Operation Windglass," he whispered. And that was when their faces changed from curiosity to disbelief to shame. Even my father went pale. He didn't say a word, just like I had learned from him. I held his gaze, my father's, for the first time in years. Not as his daughter. Not as the girl he'd dismissed at 13 for refusing to drop Arabic in favor of Latin. Not as the young woman he'd disowned for choosing direct action teams over diplomatic corps. I looked at him as someone who had bled for every inch of her credibility, every scar, every rank. I didn't want his apology. I wanted him to witness. All those years ago, he told me speaking to enemies in Arabic wasn't heroic. He said I was wasting my mind. He told my brother during a rescue briefing in front of a full room that real soldiers don't talk. They pull triggers, but I had done both. And when the time came, 12 SEALs men who knew me only from the legend of my aim stood and turned toward me before the brass did. During my last promotion, they faced me, not the flag. And my father, he sat in the audience and watched it happen without saying a single word. That was his way of admitting he had been wrong by not trying to spin it. For once, he stayed silent. And silence from a man like him was louder than any speech. Back at the range, no one approached me at first. They were still adjusting to the weight of what they'd just seen. But their silence wasn't mocking anymore. It was reverent. The same young man who'd joked about letting me shoot for fun turned to his buddy and whispered, "Did you see that grouping?" His friend replied. That wasn't just skill. That was discipline. And they were right. This wasn't luck. This wasn't some fluke. This was earned. Inch by inch. Failure by failure. Not despite the silence, but because of it. As I packed up my gear, my father finally took a few steps in my direction. He didn't say much. Just one line. "Still that quiet girl, huh?" I zipped the bag shut and stood tall. "No," I said. "I'm the woman who made quiet speak." I walked past him then, and I didn't look back. Because this wasn't about his shame. This was about reclaiming the lane where I was once told I didn't belong. Lane 7. Where the lowly soldier shut them all up with a trigger pull. Where silence became its own kind of justice. and where my story finally was no longer his to tell. I was born into a family that didn't just serve in the military, they lived in it. My grandfather fought in Korea. My father commanded units in the Gulf. My brother went straight to West Point and came out polished, promising, and perfectly aligned with everything the Delaney name stood for, at least in their eyes. And then there was me, the youngest, the only daughter, the outlier. No one said it outright, but the expectation was clear from the moment I could read a map and carry my own pack. The boys serve, the girls stay quiet. My father never raised a hand to me. He didn't need to. His silence did more damage than shouting ever could. When he disapproved, the air got colder, the house quieter. We all learned to read the temperature of a room by the set of his jaw. He never wanted me in uniform. He used to say the same line every time someone joked about me joining up. "Combat's no place for women. Leave that to the boys." It was never loud, but it was firm, like everything he believed in. He said it the way people say gravity is real or fire burns, as if there was no room for debate. When I told him I'd enlisted, it was over dinner. He was carving roast beef, the kind of quiet Sunday meal that felt like ritual. My mother passed the bread. My brother asked for more potatoes. I unfolded the paper slowly, slid it across the table. He didn't look at it. He didn't speak. He just put the knife down and stood up. He left the room without a word and didn't speak to me again for 6 months. My mother tried to soften the blow, but she wasn't the bridge between us. She was the rope stretched too thin. She'd whisper things like, "Just give him time, or he comes from a different generation." But I wasn't asking for understanding. I was asking to be seen. I didn't enlist to rebel. I didn't do it to get back at him. I did it because I belonged there. The first time I held an M4, I felt clarity, like everything I'd been told, not to be suddenly made sense in my hands. I wasn't reckless. I was measured. I wasn't emotional. I was aware. I didn't crave chaos. I understood order. They say some people are built for war. I wasn't. But I was built for service. Built for sharp decisions, for quiet leadership, for the kind of courage that doesn't ask for praise. My brother wrote to me once during basic congratulating me, but even his words felt filtered. Like he wasn't sure if he should admire me or correct me. Dad never called, never sent a letter, but he made sure my medical records and training performance were tracked. My CO told me so in private. "He's watching," he said. "Just not the way you think." That's when I understood my father didn't hate that I wore the uniform. He hated that I wore it better than he expected. And that more than anything was the start of the war between us. Not a war of bullets, but of bloodlines and expectations, and the sound of a daughter refusing to stay small. My brother Alex was the golden boy. He never had to fight for attention. It was given to him before he even asked. He was taller, louder, charming in that predictable way. Officers tend to be always crisp, always polished, always smiling at the right moments. He graduated from West Point with honors, top 10 in his class, got fast-tracked into infantry command, featured in recruitment brochures, and praised at family dinners even when he wasn't home. My father called him a born leader, like the rest of us were just shadows cast by his shine. And then there was me. I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. I was quiet because no one was listening. When I enlisted, I started in logistics, packing crates, managing supplies, hauling gear in places most people couldn't find on a map. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't respected. But it taught me 2 things that would shape everything else: precision and patience. I knew every serial number on every rifle I loaded. I learned to memorize terrain routes by heart, not because someone told me to, but because I hated the feeling of being underestimated. Eventually, I put in for a transfer infantry. My CO tried to talk me out of it. "You've got a brain," he said. "No need to go where the bullets fly." But I wasn't afraid of bullets. I was afraid of getting stuck behind someone else's legacy. So I moved forward. Infantry taught me how to endure. It stripped everything unnecessary down to grit and instincts. I ran farther than I thought I could, fought harder than I thought I had to, and after a year I volunteered for something more: special operations selection. That's where the noise stopped. Not because it got easier, but because the ones who doubted me stopped keeping up. There's no room for bravado in the middle of a 12-mile ruck march under full weight. No time for ego when you're blindfolded, disoriented, and being screamed at in 3 languages. You either perform, Or you go home. I didn't go home. They called me the quiet one. That was my nickname in training. Some even thought I didn't speak English. I never corrected them. What was the point? Over time, stories began to spread. A woman who could outshoot the instructors, who never raised her voice, who never missed a mark in urban navigation, who never failed a field scenario, not once. They didn't know my name, but they told my story. I became a rumor, a ghost in regulation boots. Some said I'd been deployed undercover in Yemen. Others whispered I'd broken up a weapons ring without ever firing a shot. None of that was accurate, but I didn't stop them. I didn't need credit. I just needed distance. Because legends are safer when they don't wear name tags. I never chased recognition. I chased standards mine. And in every mile I ran, every corridor I cleared, I wasn't just proving something to the army. I was building a different version of myself, one they couldn't reduce to emotional or ambitious or stubborn. I was still Faye Delaney. But now I was a story they couldn't trace back to my family tree. Not even my brother could rewrite that. The moment I saw the schedule, I knew what it meant. Joint live fire rotation at the old training grounds near Fort Dalton, the same place where my father had served as a weapons instructor for nearly a decade. The place where his name was still mentioned with reverence by senior staff and sideways glances from the younger ones. The range was practically his second home. So when I saw it on the orders, I knew he'd be there. Not might. Would. And I didn't flinch. 5 years ago, I would have found a way out, transferred duty, pulled a deployment card, volunteered for a satellite team, just to avoid being in the same zip code. But not now. Not after everything I had built on my own. It was time. Not for confrontation, not for revenge. Just clarity. I wasn't the same woman he last saw in uniform. And I didn't need to prove that to him. I just needed him to see it, even if he never said a word. The morning of the exercise, I packed light. 1 bag, standard gear. My own M24, the one that had been with me since Syria. Most people brought whatever the armory issued that week. I preferred what was tested, trusted, battle-worn. I rolled up my left sleeve just enough to let the tattoo breathe. I didn't hide it anymore. It wasn't about pride. It was about ownership. That tattoo had been earned, not gifted, not inherited. A symbol inked in sweat and silence after 19 days in the field, without radio contact guiding civilians through enemy terrain under sniper cover. I had to provide alone. No ceremony. Just a needle and a corporal who owed me his life. The drive to Fort Dalton was quiet. Familiar terrain rolled past the window, pine gravel roads, chain-link fences lined with faded flags. I remembered walking here as a child, trailing behind my father on family days, pretending the firing lines were secret missions and the echoing shots were part of some heroic orchestration. Back then I thought he was untouchable. Now I understood he was just loud. The real power came from the ones who didn't need to shout. When I arrived, the other units were already forming lines. SEAL candidates, Army Rangers, a few logistics teams assigned to observe. Nobody knew me. That was the point. My name was still on the official roster, but no rank was listed. I had made sure of that. Let the noise come first. Let the assumptions settle. Then I'd speak in the only language that mattered: groupings and glass breaks. I checked in at the registration table, signed the clipboard with a pen that skipped twice, then handed over my ID without a word. The staff sergeant nodded and pointed to lane assignments. Lane 7. Far end, quiet. Away from the chatter and the Bluetooth speakers and the egos. Perfect. As I made my way across the lot, I caught a glimpse of him, my father, standing with a group of instructors near the center lanes, clipboard in hand, still wearing that hat he never took off, still leaning on his right leg like his left knee carried a ghost. He didn't see me, not yet, but I saw him. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't brace for impact. I walked right past him, head high, not as his daughter, but as a soldier who no longer needed permission to take up space. I saw him before he saw me. My father hadn't changed much. His hair was almost completely gray now, but it was still cut short in that same rigid military style he'd worn my entire childhood. His posture was straight, almost aggressive, as if relaxing would betray some core part of him. Even off-duty, he stood like someone reviewing a battalion. He was standing near the central control tower with 3 other instructors, arms crossed, clipboard pressed to his chest. Laugh lines carved deep around his mouth, though I had never known him to smile for long, and a faded ball cap sat low over his eyes, casting a shadow that always made reading his expression impossible. He didn't see me, not right away. When he finally did, it was by accident. I was double-checking the bolt on my rifle near the edge of the bench at Lane 7 Sunglasses, pushed halfway up, sweat already slicking the back of my neck. I felt the shift before I saw it. The way silence bends a little tighter when someone looks directly at you. His eyes passed over me like I was another nameless recruit in a sea of uniforms. No pause, no flicker, nothing. And I realized that still hurt more than I wanted it to. He'd always known how to erase me without moving a muscle. A group of younger soldiers stood nearby, newer faces, mostly guys in their early 20s, full of caffeine and misplaced confidence. One of them had noticed my name during registration. He leaned toward his buddy and asked loud enough for me to hear, "Is she the Delaney that got fast-tracked because of her dad?" The other laughed. "Probably. Classic legacy stuff. Look at her, probably here to check a box." I didn't respond. I didn't even turn. That used to get under my skin. It used to make me want to shout my resume list. My deployments waved medals in the air until someone understood. But now I just loaded the next magazine. Nearby, another soldier joined in. Wonder if she even knows how to zero that thing. That's when I felt it, that lazy echo of my father's influence. They didn't know me, but they could see him. And they were copying him like sons copy their father's jokes. The tone, the dismissiveness, the quiet undermining. That was the part he never admitted. His silence gave others permission. He didn't need to insult me directly anymore. He just had to show them how little I mattered. And they followed suit like it was part of the training manual. A familiar sting settled at the base of my throat. I kept my breathing even, hands steady. I remembered what I'd told myself before coming here. This isn't about him, but standing there in the same heat-soaked gravel lot where I once learned how to handle a weapon under his shadow. It was hard not to feel 12 years old again. Too loud, too emotional, too eager to be accepted by someone who had no intention of ever letting me in. I didn't flinch, didn't blink. I chambered the next round, looked down the scope, and said nothing. Because silence was the first thing he taught me. And now it was the sharpest weapon I had. He did exactly what I knew he would do. Midway through the equipment check, just as everyone was settling into their lanes, my father's voice cut through the air, louder than necessary, sharp enough to draw attention without being obvious. "Lane 7, he called out. "You want to take a crack at the target, just for fun." Just for fun. That was his favorite weapon, sarcasm wrapped in politeness. He'd used it on new recruits, old friends, even junior officers. But when he used it on me, it carried more than condescension. It carried memory. I didn't turn around, didn't respond right away. Someone near me chuckled. Another muttered, "Oof, someone's getting volunteered." It was all part of the game. They thought he was hazing a rookie, testing the weak link. The man in charge tossing a bone to the underdog for a little comic relief. They had no idea. He stepped closer, just far enough for others to notice, just loud enough for them to lean in. "Don't worry," he said, still smiling. "There's no pressure. Hit the paper, and we'll call it a win." I could feel the eyes on me now, half curious, half amused. One of the younger guys nudged his buddy and whispered, "She gonna shoot or fold?" I kept my expression neutral. This was how he worked. Set the trap with a joke, then watch to see if you'd humiliate yourself trying to prove something. And if you did prove something well, he'd say it didn't count because the conditions weren't real. You were either the fool who failed or the fool who cared too much. I knew this game. He used to play it at the dinner table with words. Now he played it on gravel with rifles. But this time, I let him start it. I nodded slowly and rose to my feet, careful not to move too fast or too slow. Just another soldier doing what she was told. Someone clapped lightly, someone else whistled. The tone was still light. They were expecting a joke. Good. Let them. Let them believe I was just another name with no story behind it. Let them enjoy the moment before it shifted. I took my position at the line, adjusted the shoulder strap, and checked the wind direction, not that I needed to. It was habit. Ritual. Every movement precise, automatic. Not for show, but because that's how you survive when the stakes aren't a paper target. Behind me, my father crossed his arms. "Whenever you're ready," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. This wasn't about readiness. It was about patience. and I had more of it than anyone here could measure. I leaned into the stock, exhaled slowly, and let my mind go quiet. They thought they were watching someone try. But I wasn't trying. I was remembering. The mission in Aleppo. The midnight shot on a rooftop in Kandahar. The 3 hostages I brought home because I didn't flinch when the wind shifted. This wasn't a performance. This was muscle memory and silence forged under pressure. And as I settled into the stance, one thought echoed through me, not bitter, not angry, just simple and steady. Let them laugh now, because they wouldn't be laughing much longer. The real confrontation didn't happen at the target line. It happened in the silence between us. There were no raised voices, no dramatic speeches, no gasps from the crowd. Just a quiet challenge embedded in a glance, and my answer buried in the way I walked toward the firing lane, measured, calm, unshaken. I had brought the same rifle I carried through my second tour in Iraq. The paint was chipped near the barrel. The scope was slightly foggy around the edges. It wasn't flashy or upgraded like the ones the younger guys brought out, custom builds with laser sights and bipods that looked like they belonged on a catalog cover. Mine was simple, but it had history. That weapon had been with me through sandstorms, urban clearings, rooftop overwatch, and 12 hours lying still beneath broken concrete in Mosul. It didn't need to be pretty. It needed to work, and it always did. I signed in without hesitation, scrawling F. Delaney across the clipboard in clean, even strokes. No rank, no title, just the name they had tried to forget, and the one I had worked so hard to reclaim on my own terms. The staff sergeant at the table raised an eyebrow as he glanced at my ID, then back at the roster. Delaney. Any relation? I just nodded once. Yeah, I said. Something like that. I moved past him before he could ask more. Lane 7. Far enough from the others that no one could crowd me. No distractions, no noise. Just the wind, the heat, and the weight of something much heavier than the weapon in my hands. As I unpacked the rifle and laid it gently across the bench, I didn't look toward the instructor's stand. But I could feel him watching. I knew his posture. I knew the way his arms folded across his chest when he wanted to seem impartial, but was anything but. I knew the little smirk he gave when he expected someone to fail. But this wasn't about failure. It was about control and the fact that this was the one part of me he never had control over. He taught me how to shoot, yes, but he never taught me how to own it. That part came later in places where his name couldn't protect me and his reputation didn't matter. I adjusted my scope, loaded 1 round, checked wind speed again out of habit more than need. Then I exhaled. The air was thick with expectation. Most of the guys behind me were still joking, probably figuring they'd get a good laugh before lunch. They didn't know what was coming. I wasn't here to impress them. I wasn't here to prove anything to a room full of voices trying to sound important. I was here because this was the one place, this exact moment, where my father couldn't interrupt me. He couldn't correct me. He couldn't talk over me. He couldn't change the outcome. The paper target downrange didn't care about bloodlines or legacy. It didn't care about old grudges or whispered jokes. It only measured one thing: truth. And when the shot finally rang out sharp and precise, it was the cleanest sound I had ever heard. Not just because of the accuracy, but because for the first time in my life, I knew I was fully, undeniably seen. The moment the final shot landed, everything went still. It wasn't just quiet, it was suspended, like the air had been holding its breath and didn't quite know how to exhale. I lowered the rifle, slowly placed it back on the bench, and stood up, not quickly, not triumphantly, just purposefully. I didn't look around. I didn't need to. I already knew. The target retrieval system slid the paper forward, and there it was, 30 shots, clean, surgical, stacked tighter than any grouping most of them would ever see in their lives. The center was obliterated. There was nothing left of the bullseye but shredded fiber. Someone let out a soft curse under their breath. Then another voice, younger, cracked a joke, half laugh, half disbelief. Did she just beat McNulty's record? No one answered, because the truth was hanging in the air too heavily now to make room for humor. I stepped back from the line, peeled off my gloves, and rolled up my left sleeve, not deliberately, not dramatically, but just enough to let my skin breathe. The heat was rising, and the sweat along my forearm clung to the ink like it always did. And that's when I felt it. Eyes locking onto me, Not casual, not curious aware. A man stepped forward from the shaded group near the tower, older, silver-haired, still fit in that slow-burning kind of way. His uniform was sharp. Rank bars glittered faintly. He wasn't just anyone. You could tell from how others instinctively shifted when he moved. Colonel Braddock. I hadn't seen him in years, but I recognized his gait instantly. He didn't walk toward me so much as drift-focused, deliberate. His gaze dropped to my arm and froze. He stared for a second too long. Not because he didn't recognize it, but because he did. The ink on my skin wasn't pretty. It wasn't new. It wasn't meant for admiration. It was the Recon Delta sniper insignia, hand-inked, earned in silence, after completing one of the most grueling joint certification operations in the field. Only 8 of us passed that course the year I did. 3 are no longer alive. You don't get that tattoo in a shop. You don't talk about it. You don't ask for permission to wear it. You survive. And then someone gives it to you. The colonel blinked. "You're her," he said quietly. That was all, just 2 words, half a question. But the disbelief in his tone told me exactly what he thought he knew and what he never expected to see standing in front of him. I nodded once. No smile, no acknowledgement beyond the necessary. Let him carry the rest of that weight himself. Behind him, a few more officers had gathered, following his eyes like predators sensing a shift in the herd. One of them gasped softly. Another stepped forward, squinting at the ink like it might change under scrutiny. But it didn't. It was real, permanent, earned. I could see it on their faces now, the math they were trying to do in their heads. The stories they'd heard in passing. The rumors about a female sniper with impossible precision who never left a signature, never filed for recognition, and never showed up in award ceremonies. They thought it was a myth, until now. I didn't offer clarification, because in that moment, my silence said everything. I stepped off the firing line. No one said a word. The same young soldiers who had laughed earlier, who'd cracked jokes about legacy kids and paper shooters, now stared at the gravel, like it held answers they couldn't find in their rifles. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't offer comments. They didn't need to. Their silence was enough. I walked past them without changing pace. Not slow, not proud, just steady, measured. Like the cadence of breath between trigger squeezes. The space where doubt used to live now filled with certainty. I didn't need applause. I didn't need their nods or whispered validation behind cupped hands. I didn't need them to say they were wrong, because they already knew. The real shift wasn't in them. It was in him. I didn't look at my father, not at first, but I could feel his attention trailing me like smoke, acrid, dense, impossible to ignore. The kind that follows you even when you leave the fire behind. I knew that feeling. I'd lived with it my entire life. He stood rigid, arms folded, but not in command this time. There was no confidence in the way his shoulders squared off. No ease in the way he scanned the range. He was too still. The kind of stillness that isn't control, but containment, like a dam trying to hold back a flood. He hadn't expected this. Not the record, not the tattoo, and definitely not the silence that followed. For years he had built his world on authority, rank, discipline. Rules he wrote without room for dissent. Everything he believed about power came down to control, and I had slipped outside of it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't try to challenge what he'd seen, because what could he say? The paper target didn't lie. The colonel's reaction didn't lie. The stunned faces didn't lie. And my presence, undeniable, unapologetic, didn't need him to explain or dismiss anymore. He had spent my entire childhood trying to define me by what I wasn't. Not strong enough, not obedient enough, not the right kind of soldier, but now I had stepped into a space he couldn't narrate. And that scared him more than anything. I moved toward the gear bench, calmly disassembling the rifle. Piece by piece I laid it out, cleaning cloth in hand, motions precise and methodical. The routine grounded me, focused me. Around me the rest of the range carried on, but differently. The noise was lower, the jokes were quieter. The arrogance that had been so thick earlier now felt more like hesitation, like uncertainty had finally cracked open the mirror they were all too used to staring into. One of the younger soldiers finally stepped closer, not to speak, just to return a spent casing I'd left on the ground. He placed it on the bench, gently nodded once, then stepped away. That was all, but it meant everything. Still I didn't smile, didn't nod back. not because I didn't appreciate the gesture, but because I didn't need his recognition either. And as I finished wiping the barrel and snapped the case shut, I glanced sideways at my father. He was still watching, still silent. But this time it wasn't a weapon, it was witness. For the first time, the silence wasn't his tool, it was mine. Because now, he couldn't control who I'd become, and he couldn't take credit for it either. The whispers started small like wind brushing through tall grass, but they spread quickly. Someone near the back of the line pulled out their phone. I heard the soft tap of fingers against glass, the familiar rhythm of someone typing into a search bar. He wasn't even subtle about it. Another soldier leaned in and muttered, "Dude, just Google it. Sniper female, no public record. There's gotta be something." They weren't wrong. There was something, but not much. Because that's how it was designed. A few years back, someone online had pieced together fragments of reports, deployment rosters, mission commendations that didn't name names. They called it the Ghost Woman, a sniper in Recon Delta who had no official image, no interviews, no ceremony footage. Just a trail of mentions in redacted after-action memos and a blurred still from a grainy drone clip. Most thought it was a myth, a narrative someone had built for clicks, until now. And as their eyes flicked from their screens to me, I knew they were making the connection. Same build, same rifle, same tattoo. I sat at the edge of the bench, arms resting loosely across my legs. The heat had risen fast. Texas sun never asked permission, so I rolled both sleeves up to my shoulders. Not to make a point, not to posture, just to breathe. But the moment the ink fully showed the range, fell into a different kind of silence, one weighted with recognition. It wasn't just the soldiers watching now. A group of officers near the tower had begun drifting closer, their voices low and clipped. And then unexpectedly, one broke formation. She wasn't in standard fatigues. Her nameplate wasn't visible. Her movements were confident but not commanding. She walked like someone used to watching others very closely. I knew that posture. She stopped a few feet in front of me. "Delaney," she said, not a question. Her voice was flat but not unfriendly. I looked up, meeting her eyes. Recognition passed between us like static. I remembered her now, Captain Iris Monroe, Counterintelligence. We'd worked together years ago on an embedded inquiry into a stolen arms pipeline routed through southern Syria. She'd been sharp, unflinching, and buried so deep under clearance levels that even her coffee orders were probably redacted. I said nothing. She didn't need me to. Her eyes dropped to the tattoo on my arm. "You never debriefed out." It wasn't an accusation, just an observation, one only someone in her position would dare to say aloud. I gave a slow nod. "Didn't need to," I replied. She tilted her head slightly, almost like a smirk wanted to surface, but didn't. Around us, the buzz intensified. The ones who hadn't made the connection yet were getting it secondhand. Monroe's presence only confirmed what had once been speculation. I wasn't just a soldier, I was part of something else. The kind of work no one brags about. The kind of work that doesn't show up in resumes or award ceremonies. The kind that catches people lying where paper trails run cold. One of the younger staff sergeants edged closer, clearly trying to listen without looking like he was. He pretended to be checking the target retrieval line, but his eyes were fixed on me. I stayed still. I didn't move. I didn't offer anything. I just sat in the heat, letting the truth settle. Because when you've been part of an investigation that peeled back the layers of corruption in your own ranks, you learn quickly words are tools. Silence is a weapon. And right now, silence was doing the job better than any report I could write. Captain Monroe gave one last look at my arm, then stepped back and faded into the background like smoke in the wind. Just as quickly as she'd arrived, she was gone. But the echo of that exchange lingered. They all saw it. They all understood. I hadn't just broken a shooting record. I'd walked into this place wearing history they'd only heard about in briefings, then confirmed it with a breath, a scar, and a glance. And suddenly, no one was wondering who I was. They were wondering what else I knew. The truth is, I didn't come to that shooting range just to settle a personal score. I came because 2 years ago I stumbled into something that started as a whisper and grew into a wildfire. It began with a discrepancy, a single soldier on our deployment rotation, who'd been cleared through a specialized urban warfare course I knew he hadn't attended. The certificate was real. The course completion number was real. But he had never been on the roster. I checked it myself. At first I thought it was a clerical error. Maybe someone cut corners. Maybe some admin sergeant filled a quota without checking names. It happens. Not often, but it does. But then it happened again. And again. 3 soldiers, then 5, then 8 spread across different units, but all with the same stamp certified through a training detachment, housed under the Fort Dalton Regional umbrella. A place I hadn't thought about in years, until I remembered. That was his old post. My father had served as a senior advisor there for a long time after he retired from field duty. Technically, he was just a consultant, but anyone who knew how those systems worked understood that consultants had more pull than most captains. They weren't bound by promotion chains. They had history, respect, influence, and they knew where to push quietly. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was coincidence, that someone else was manipulating his network, that maybe he didn't know. But the deeper I looked, the harder it became to hold on to that version of him. The forged records weren't subtle. They were confident, systematic, built on the assumption that no one would double-check, that no one would question a signature on a completed course, especially not if it came with the Delaney name. So I started documenting, not as a daughter, but as an operative. I embedded quietly with CID's internal audit team, off the books, unofficial, technically, not even authorized. I wasn't investigating him, I was investigating the pattern. That was how I justified it to myself. I didn't want it to be him. I just wanted to find the leak close, fix the damage. But the further I traced the approvals, the tighter the loop became. And his name kept showing up. Not just as a witness, not just as a retired reference, but as a point of contact. At first it was small initials on paperwork, phone logs from his known number. Then came direct links, travel reimbursements, signed by him, special waivers approved under his login ID notes, in margins in his handwriting. We pulled physical files from a locked cabinet, and there it was, his signature scrawled beside names that should never have passed clearance. That was when I knew. It wasn't a mistake, it was a system. One built on Favor's ego and a fear of being irrelevant. The kind of system where you bend rules for recruits that make you feel important again. The kind of system where ethics are optional if no one's looking. And I was looking. But I hadn't said a word. Not yet. Because the moment you go after a man like that, especially when he's your father, you better make sure the ground beneath you doesn't crack open first. So I waited, I gathered. And I chose that range that day because I knew he'd be there. Because nothing exposes rot faster than pressure. The evidence was layered but not complicated. A thumb drive of recordings, private conversations between officers who didn't know I was listening, screenshots of text messages from instructors trading favors for slot placements, anonymous tip-offs from instructors who had reached their breaking point but didn't want to be the first to speak up, financial logs from a quietly run side operation, one that offered expedited course certification in exchange for off-the-record consulting fees. Every document was traceable. Every name tied to a date, a phone call, a timestamp. I had also recovered something worse: internal memos that had been manually edited, not system logs. Actual PDFs resaved with small but damning red lines. Soldiers marked unfit in the original draft, suddenly marked recommended in the revised version. In one of them, someone even added a false notation of field testing, completely fabricated. I matched font metadata, cross-reference modification timestamps. You don't work in field intelligence for a decade without learning how to read footprints left in code. And then, buried in a folder that had been deleted but not scrubbed, I found it. An email, short, unpolished, no salutation, just one line of text and a signature. I knew that girl would cause problems. She's always been defiant. Remove her from the candidate pool. Sender Lieutenant Colonel A. Delaney, my father. It wasn't addressed to anyone directly, but the metadata told us enough. It had been forwarded twice within the Fort Dalton system. From there, decisions had followed. I'd been dropped from a short list I hadn't even known I was on. That was the part that burned, not the insult. The invisibility. He hadn't told me I wasn't ready. He hadn't called me to explain his concerns. He'd just erased me quietly, surgically, like I was an inconvenient problem on a spreadsheet. I had always known he saw me as less. But this was confirmation. Still, I didn't react. Not then. I logged the file, labeled it, archived the trail. Because if I was going to bring it forward, I needed to do it on my terms. Not with anger, not as a daughter seeking revenge, but as a professional exposing a breach. He had taught me to be silent, disciplined, strategic. He just never imagined I'd use those same tools against him. The courtroom wasn't grand. It wasn't even a real courtroom, just a converted training hall with folding chairs, 3 flags, and 2 rows of brass, who'd seen too much in their years to flinch at anything. But I stood tall anyway. Dress uniform, clean boots, my badge and clearance card tucked out of sight. I wasn't there to flaunt anything. I was there to finish something. My father sat across from me at the table designated for involved personnel, not as the accused yet, but as a figure of interest. His hands were folded, his face unreadable, but I saw the tightness in his jaw, the way he blinked a fraction too slow. He hadn't expected me to show up. He definitely hadn't expected me to speak. I wasn't scheduled to testify, but after the hearing opened, the presiding officer asked if I had anything to contribute. I rose. No script, no hesitation. "Ma'am," I began. "What I'm about to submit is not a statement of grievance. It is a report, fully sourced, independently verified. My role in this is twofold. I am both a witness and an investigator." A pause. Then I placed the sealed packet on the desk. Inside is documentation of training manipulations spanning over 3 years, originating from personnel attached to Fort Dalton's certification unit. Included are signed records, financial logs, redacted interviews, and digital trail analysis. I've highlighted the chain of approvals that leads on multiple occasions through Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Delaney. No gasp, no protest, only silence. My father didn't say a word. He didn't look away either. I turned to the panel. There is also a secondary note attached to an internal email, which names me directly as a liability. That note was used to alter my candidacy status during a classified selection process without my knowledge or right to appeal. That was the moment I stopped reading, because everything else they needed was in the folder: the truth, the proof, the system. I turned back toward him, not as his daughter, but as the woman he tried to erase. He blinked again, slower this time, then shifted in his chair. The presiding officer asked if he wished to respond. He didn't. He just shook his head and whispered, "No, ma'am." And that was when I knew he wasn't going to fight it, because he couldn't. I had taken every weapon he ever used against me, doubt, silence, control, and dismantled them one by one. Not with vengeance, with clarity. And when I walked out of that room, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. The aftermath wasn't clean. Justice never is. Some people called me a hero. They wrote posts on military forums about integrity and courage, how it takes someone strong to hold even their own family accountable. My inbox filled with anonymous thank yous, from soldiers who had watched their own leaders get away with less. But just as many accused me of betrayal. Whispers spread through back channels, stuff like, "She went after her own blood," or "If she can do that to her father, imagine what she'd do to you." Some said I was power-hungry. Others claimed I had personal motives. A few even suggested I'd fabricated everything to elevate my own career. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. Because none of it mattered. I hadn't done it for validation. I hadn't done it for headlines. I hadn't even done it for closure. I did it because the uniform deserved better. Because the soldiers who show up every day and do the hard work, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who never get promoted for smiling the right way in the right room, they deserve to know the system hadn't been fully bought out. I did it because I love the Army, not the politics, not the hierarchy, not the mythology, the work. And if protecting that meant exposing my father, then so be it. A week after the hearing, I got a call. I almost didn't pick up. Unknown number, no voicemail. I let it ring once, twice. Something inside me tightened. Then I answered. "Hello?" A pause. Then the voice I hadn't heard in 4 years. "Is this Faye?" I froze. It wasn't the question. It was the tone, tired, low, like gravel had worn down the edges. "It's me," I said. Another pause. "Then why'd you do it?" His voice cracked, just a little. "Why'd you do that to me?" It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't angry. It was confused. like a man who couldn't figure out when the house he built stopped being his. I sat still for a long moment before answering. I didn't do it to you, I said softly. I did it because of you. What the hell does that mean? I swallowed. It means I did it to stop the kind of leadership that abuses the system you once told me to respect. Another silence. Then the faintest exhale part, sigh, part, surrender. You always were defiant, he muttered. I could have argued. Could have reminded him that being defiant is sometimes the only way to stay intact. But I didn't. I just let him sit in it. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't hang up. He just went quiet. And then the line went dead. 2 weeks passed before I heard anything else. I wasn't expecting an update. The tribunal process is slow, especially when high-ranking names are involved. But then the envelope arrived hand-delivered through internal military couriers stamped with the seal of the Judge Advocate General's office. Inside was a statement. From him, typed, signed, dated. A formal admission of responsibility. Not just for the forged certifications, but for orchestrating the system around it, coaching junior officers to ignore red flags, approving rosters he knew weren't accurate, and leveraging his name to secure placements he claimed were in the Army's best interest. It wasn't a plea deal. It was a confession. Attached was a personal request that his actions not result in career-ending repercussions for the junior officers involved. They followed my lead, he wrote. If there is guilt, it is mine. It was unexpected. Not just the honesty, but the tone. He didn't rationalize. He didn't shift blame. He just admitted it line by line without qualification. It read like a man finally ready to stop holding the walls up with excuses. That should have been enough. But then there was the letter, folded in half, handwritten, short, 3 sentences. I used to think you were soft, that you didn't have what it took. I was wrong. That was it. No greeting, no sign-off, just those words. 3 lines that somehow hit harder than every year of silence, every cold glance, every undermining comment he'd ever thrown my way. He had never written to me before, not like that. Growing up, the only words I got from him were corrections, warnings, orders. If I ever got praise, it was indirect, meant for someone else's ears, or masked in sarcasm so thick you could never be sure. But this was real, and I knew it cost him something to write it. Still, I didn't know what to do with it. I held the paper for hours, reread it 10 times, folded and unfolded it until the creases blurred the ink. I didn't cry. I didn't clutch it to my chest like some long-lost treasure. But I didn't throw it away either. Because whether I wanted to or not, those words mattered. They didn't fix what had been broken, but they acknowledged it had been broken. And for someone like him, that was more than I ever expected. I never replied. Not to the letter, not to the message it carried. Not even when he called again twice, leaving voicemails that started with silence and ended with breath. I didn't ignore him out of spite. I just didn't know what to say. Because by the time the words came, the damage had already settled into its final shape. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about justice. It was about reckoning with who he'd been, who I had become, and the space between us that had never been bridgeable. Some nights I'd unfold the letter again, those 3 lines, and wonder what kind of man he might have been if he hadn't been so afraid of softness. If he hadn't taught me that silence was safer than truth. If he hadn't tried so hard to control everything that he forgot how to witness it. I didn't hate him. I never had. Even at my angriest, I had just wanted him to see me. Not as a soldier, not as a daughter, but as a person, someone who existed outside of his shadow, someone who could choose right over easy, even when it hurt. And maybe writing that letter was his way of saying he finally did. Still, I didn't need a reunion. I didn't need a hug or a conversation where we pretended years of damage could be undone with a few well-placed apologies. I just needed him to carry his own shame. And it seems he did. The court stripped his advisory role. He lost the honors they once whispered about at family barbecues. His face never showed up in Army brochures again. He faded quietly, almost appropriately, into the background. But I stayed. And I kept working. Because there are always more battles to fight. Not the kind with rifles or medals. The kind where you stand up in rooms that want you small and stay standing. I kept the letter in a small wooden box at the back of my closet. I never showed it to anyone, never mentioned it aloud, but I never forgot it either. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's dignity, and the grace to walk away before the other person is ready to admit they were wrong. I came back to the range months later, not as a competitor, not as a record breaker, but as something else entirely. The same gravel crunched beneath my boots, the same heat pressed down against my skin. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything had. The old voices were gone, the doubts quieter. I didn't walk in looking for a fight. I walked in with purpose. Lane 7 was open. It always seemed to be. Some places keep their own memory. That stretch of concrete and weathered wood had watched me fall apart, hold the line, and finally stand up without flinching. It had become more than a lane. It was a threshold. This time I didn't bring a scope. Just a clipboard, a training manual, and a set of eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by noise. A group of young soldiers stood near the perimeter, mostly fresh faces, a couple with ribbons still stiff from the last ceremony. Eager eyes, restless hands. The kind of posture that says they want to learn but are too proud to ask. One of them, a private couldn't have been older than 20, approached me slowly. His steps were tentative, respectful. He looked like someone who had heard 100 versions of a story, and finally met the one person who could confirm whether it was real. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you the sniper from those Delta stories?" I let the question sit for a second. Not to be dramatic, just to weigh it. I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't mocking me. He wasn't chasing legend. He just wanted to know. I gave a soft smile. "No," I said gently. "I'm just someone who learned when to be quiet." That answer landed heavier than I expected. He nodded almost reverently, like it explained more than the stories ever had. Maybe it did. They didn't need a hero. They needed an example. Something real, tangible. A reminder that calm can win the war. That control isn't weakness, and that there is strength in refusing to perform. I didn't bring medals. I didn't wear rank. My nameplate was tucked in my bag. I didn't need it to speak for me anymore. The range sergeant waved me over. He knew why I was here. "Class is yours," he said. Simply then stepped back. I took my place not at lane 7 but beside it. Because I wasn't here to shoot. I was here to teach. They asked me how to hold the rifle. I taught them how to breathe. Inhale for 4, exhale for 6. Control isn't just about the hand on the trigger. It's about the mind behind the sight. Anyone can pull. Not everyone can wait. They asked me how to pick a target. I showed them how to observe. Don't rush. Don't blink. Don't let adrenaline write your decision. You look at wind distance, heat shimmer. You listen for what no one says. You see the terrain not for its threat, but for its rhythm. The ground talks if you know how to read it. They asked how to shoot under pressure. I taught them how to stand still in chaos, how to keep their thoughts from eating their vision, how to separate fear from instinct, how to let logic speak louder than panic. You don't train to be fearless, you train to keep moving despite the fear. I didn't talk about glory. I didn't tell war stories. That's not what they needed. They needed truth, the kind that sits between victories, the kind that survives failure, the kind that stays when the applause ends. At one point, one of the soldiers, quiet kid, good balance, better timing, asked me what my call sign used to be. I paused, then answered, "Didn't have one, didn't need it." He laughed. "That's the most badass thing I've ever heard." I smiled again, just slightly. And then we went back to drills. The day ended the way most do, dusty boots, sore shoulders, sunburnt necks. But as they packed up, I saw something shift in their posture. Less bravado, more focus, less noise. As if the lesson had landed deeper than just technique, as if something stuck. I walked back to lane 7 alone. No one followed. They didn't need to. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small metal plaque. It wasn't official. Just something I'd had made months ago but never found the right moment to place. I screwed it into the wood above the resting bench. 4 words, reserved until she returns. I didn't need them to know it was about me, but I needed me to know I'd left something behind. Not for recognition, for legacy. The kind that teaches you how to aim without hate, how to endure without applause, and how to stand in the storm without asking it to stop. And maybe how to leave when your work is done. They asked me once why I never became an official instructor. With all the commendations, the record, the years in the field, I could have had the title, a nameplate, a classroom, a schedule full of wide-eyed recruits. But I always answered the same, because not everything should be taught with words. Some lessons are quiet, unspoken, passed down in how you carry yourself, not how you explain yourself. You can teach someone to aim, but not to know when not to fire. You can break down breathing techniques, but not the reason to stay calm when someone's life is at stake. You can describe survival, but not what it takes to survive yourself. That kind of wisdom isn't found in binders. It's etched into skin, into silence, into memory, and sometimes into ink. The tattoo on my shoulder had begun to fade, the edges soft from years of sun and dust. Sniper Recon Delta, cut by hand, not machine. We'd earned it the old way through a gauntlet where no medal was promised and no name was ever revealed. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't designed to impress. It was meant to remember. I left it behind one afternoon, not with regret, but with reverence, alongside the rifle that had followed me across more maps than I cared to count. I'd cleaned it more than I'd spoken to most people in my 20s. It had seen me steady when my voice trembled. It had been with me through windswept cliffs, desert ruins, and rain-soaked rooftops. We had history, but it was time. I wrapped the barrel in cloth. Not military issue, just something soft. I placed it gently into a long wooden case, closed the lid, locked it once, then slid the key into my pocket and never used it again. I returned to the range one last time. Lane 7 still stood open. The breeze still whistled through the posts. The dust still clung to the corners of the sightboard. A few new recruits stood off to the side, watching quietly. They didn't ask questions. Maybe they knew not to. At the end of the lane near the worn bench where I used to set my gloves and scope, a new plaque had been added. Small, black, etched with a soldered font. Reserved for Sergeant F. Delaney until she says otherwise. No flowers, no ceremony, just space. Space that remembered what I'd given. Space that didn't need a statue to honor a ghost. They didn't retire the lane. That would have been too final, too loud. Instead, they left it untouched. As if it were waiting, not for a comeback, not for applause, just for permission. I never said goodbye to Lane 7, because you don't say goodbye to the parts of you that changed you. You just walk forward and carry them differently. Sometimes in your stride, sometimes in your silence, sometimes in the stories others tell without ever knowing they're talking about you. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to ask, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care. And if you ever find yourself at a shooting range and Lane 7 is empty, maybe just nod toward it and let it be.